My name is Claire Donovan. I am 29 years old. After 7 years of building a life together, my husband walked out the door and never looked back. He didn't leave for someone better. He left for someone richer. The moment I found out, I felt the floor disappear from under me. One week, I was a wife with a home and a future. The next, I was a woman sitting in an empty apartment with a 5-year-old daughter, a stack of unpaid bills, and exactly $412 in my bank account. My husband, Daniel, had taken the car, emptied our joint savings, and moved into a luxury condo across town with a woman named Vivian Hartwell. The Hartwells were old money. Her father, Richard Hartwell, owned 3 manufacturing companies, 2 commercial properties downtown, and a sprawling estate outside the city that most people in our town had only ever seen from the road. Daniel had spent 7 years pretending to love me while quietly positioning himself closer and closer to that family. The divorce was fast and brutal. My lawyer told me I had almost nothing to fight with. Daniel had moved our savings into a private account months before he filed. The apartment lease was in his name. I had been working part-time as a bookkeeper while raising our daughter, Emma, so my income looked thin on paper. By the time everything was finalized, I walked away with Emma, a few boxes of our things, and a debt I didn't know how to pay. My sister, Patricia, lived 40 minutes away in a small house with her husband and 2 kids. She was the first person I called the night Daniel left. Without a single hesitation, she told me to bring Emma over, that her daughter could share a room, that we would figure it out together. I want you to know that because when I tell you what happened next, you'll understand that Emma was never alone, never uncared for, never forgotten. Patricia watched her every single day while I worked. My daughter was safe, loved, and surrounded by family the entire time. That is the only reason I was able to do what I did. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I saw a job listing on a staffing agency website. Personal household assistant needed. Private residence. Competitive salary, room and board included. The description said the employer was a wealthy businessman in his 70s who had recently become increasingly difficult to manage and that previous assistants had found the role too demanding. Most people reading that would have clicked away immediately. I read it 3 times. Then I applied. 2 days later, I was sitting across from a woman named Diane Hartwell in the sitting room of the largest private home I had ever stepped inside. The ceilings were high, the furniture was dark wood and cream fabric, and everything smelled faintly of cedar and old money. Diane was in her early 40s, composed in the way that wealthy people sometimes are, where every expression feels slightly rehearsed. She was Richard Hartwell's daughter from his first marriage. She had called herself the estate manager when she introduced herself, though something about the title felt more self-appointed than official. She looked at my resume and then looked at me the way people do when they're deciding if you're beneath them. "You should know," she said, setting the paper down, "that my father is not easy. He has moments of real volatility. His doctors have described his behavior as erratic and unpredictable. Several people have quit within the first week." "What does erratic mean in this context?" I asked. She folded her hands on her knee. "He refuses meals. He shouts. He accuses people of things. He becomes confused about time and place." She paused. "Last month, he threw a paperweight at the wall during a meeting with his accountant." I thought about Emma, about the school enrollment fee due in 6 weeks, about Patricia, who had never once asked me to hurry up and find my footing, but who I knew was quietly stretching her own budget to feed 2 extra people. "I won't quit," I said. Diane studied me for a moment. Then she nodded once and stood up to show me around. The estate was enormous. The main house had 12 rooms. There was a garden in the back that had gone slightly wild, a detached garage with 3 cars that nobody drove, and a smaller building near the rear of the property that had once been a guest cottage. My room was on the ground floor of the main house, near the kitchen. It was plain and clean with a single window that looked out over the side lawn. It was more than enough. Diane brought me to Richard Hartwell's study at the end of the main hallway. She knocked twice, then opened the door slowly. The room smelled like paper and something medicinal. An old man sat in a leather chair near the window with a blanket across his lap. His hair was white and thin, his shoulders narrowed with age, but his hands, which rested on the armrests, looked like they had once belonged to someone who worked with them. Strong hands, restless. The moment he heard us enter, he turned. His eyes found me immediately. "Who is this?" he said. His voice was sharp and not at all as fragile as his posture suggested. "This is Claire, father. She's your new assistant." He stared at me for a long moment. "I don't need an assistant." "You need someone here," Diane said with the careful patience of someone who had repeated this many times. He looked back at the window. "The last one stole from me." Diane closed her eyes briefly. "Nobody stole from you. My watch is missing. Your watch is on your wrist." He looked down at his wrist. He didn't say anything after that. Diane gave me a look that said, "You see what I mean," and then quietly left us alone. I stepped closer and introduced myself again, more softly this time. He didn't respond. I told him I wasn't there to bother him, that I could sit in the chair near the door if he preferred, and that he could ignore me entirely as long as he needed to. He glanced at me sideways. "Most people talk too much," he muttered. "I'll try not to," I said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a dismissal. I pulled the chair near the door and sat down. We stayed like that for almost an hour without a single word. When I got up to leave for dinner, he said, without turning around, "Same time tomorrow." I considered that a beginning. The first 2 weeks were difficult. Mr. Hartwell refused to follow any schedule. He ate when he felt like it and slept in his chair half the night. He shouted at me twice for moving his things without permission, even though I hadn't touched anything. Once he stood up from his chair suddenly and demanded to know why the garden looked abandoned, and when I told him it had simply grown a little wild over the winter. He stared at it through the window for a long time without speaking, and I realized the garden had probably looked very different when someone he loved was still alive to tend it. I learned to move quietly. I learned to ask before I touched anything. I learned to bring his tea at exactly the same time each morning, without announcing myself, just setting it on the corner of his desk and stepping back. Slowly, the shouting happened less often. Slowly, he started to acknowledge me when I entered the room. Slowly, something that felt almost like routine began to settle between us. It was on a Tuesday evening in my 3rd week that everything changed. I had finished tidying the kitchen and was walking back toward my room through the main hallway when I heard voices coming from the formal dining room. The door was half open. I recognized Diane's voice. And then I heard another voice that stopped me completely. Daniel's voice. My hand went to the wall. I stood very still in the hallway and told myself I had misheard. But then I heard it again, that particular low laugh, the one I had spent 7 years listening to across a dinner table, and my stomach dropped through the floor. I stepped close enough to see through the gap in the door. Daniel was sitting at the far end of the dining table with a glass of wine. And beside him, leaning slightly into his shoulder, was a woman I recognized from photographs. Vivian Hartwell, Diane's younger half-sister. Richard Hartwell's daughter from his 2nd marriage. Daniel looked comfortable in that room in the way that only someone who considered it their own could look. He was telling a story and gesturing with his glass, and Diane was watching him with a thin, polished smile. I stepped back from the door before any of them could see me. I stood in the hallway for what felt like a very long time. The air in that house suddenly felt different. The job I had taken to survive, the room I was sleeping in, the old man I was learning to care for, all of it was inside the same house where my ex-husband now sat drinking wine and laughing like he had already inherited the place. A part of me wanted to pack my bag that night, to call Patricia and ask her to come get me and to never walk back through that door. But then I thought about Emma's face when I dropped her off at Patricia's that morning. The way she'd waved from the front step with her little backpack on. The school Patricia had found for her nearby. The enrollment deposit I still owed. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, and then I made the decision to stay. The next morning, Daniel saw me for the first time. I was carrying a tray with Mr. Hartwell's breakfast down the hallway when Daniel came through the front door with a set of keys in his hand. He stopped when he saw me. For a moment, his expression went completely blank. Then the corner of his mouth lifted. "Claire," he said. I kept walking. "Claire." He stepped into the hallway fully. "What are you doing here?" I stopped and turned. "I work here," I said. He looked at the tray, then he looked at me the way you look at something that used to belong to you and now looks slightly out of place. "You're the new assistant," he said slowly. Then he laughed. It was a quiet, private laugh, the kind meant only for himself. "That's something." I didn't answer. "Does Diane know?" he asked. "Know what?" He tilted his head. "That you're my ex-wife." "I imagine she'll find out eventually," I said. Then I turned and kept walking. He let me go. But I heard him laughing again as I turned the corner. After that, Daniel made a point of finding me whenever he was at the estate. He was there 3 or 4 times a week, always with Vivienne, always moving through the house like he was already mentally measuring the rooms. He would pass me in the kitchen and ask loudly if everything was going well with the staff duties. He made a comment to Vivienne once, loud enough for me to hear from the next room, that he found it very interesting how quickly some people fell after a divorce. Vivienne laughed. I cleaned the countertop I was wiping and said nothing. What I focused on instead was Mr. Hartwell. Something had been bothering me since my first week. When I first arrived, he had been sharp in flashes. Irritable, yes. Loud, yes. But also quick with certain observations, remembering exact dates, quoting things he had read decades ago, recalling the names of business partners from 30 years back without a moment of hesitation. The volatility seemed almost like frustration more than deterioration. Like someone who was being misunderstood rather than someone who was failing. But then I started noticing a pattern. His worst episodes always seemed to follow his medical appointments. After each visit from the private physician that Diane had arranged, he became more confused, more agitated, more difficult to reach. The day after appointments, he sometimes didn't recognize the housekeeper he had known for 6 years. He once called me by a name I had never heard. I said nothing at first. I watched. One morning, about 5 weeks into the job, Mr. Hartwell was having what I had come to think of as a clear day. He had eaten breakfast without complaint, had read the newspaper cover to cover, and had asked me a pointed and completely lucid question about why the quarterly report from one of his companies was 3 weeks overdue. I brought it to him. He read it carefully. And then he looked up at me with eyes that held no confusion at all, only a tired, knowing look. "You've been watching me," he said. I didn't pretend otherwise. "Yes," I said. "You've noticed something," he said. I sat down in the chair across from him. And then I told him what I had observed. That his difficult days followed his appointments. That the medication the physician left seemed to correlate with his worst episodes. That on days when something caused him to miss a dose, he was almost entirely himself. He was quiet for a very long time after I finished. Then he said, quietly and evenly, "I know." I stared at him. He set the quarterly report on the desk and folded his hands over it. He told me that he had suspected it for months but had no way to be certain because every time his mind cleared enough to think it through, another appointment would come and he would lose the thread again. He told me that Diane had been managing more and more of his affairs over the past year and that documents had been placed in front of him that he later could not remember signing. He told me that one of his oldest attorneys had tried to reach him twice and had been turned away at the door by Diane both times. His voice stayed even throughout, but his hands tightened slightly on the desk. "My daughter wants to be declared my legal guardian," he said. "Once that happens, I lose control of everything. The companies, the estate. All of it passes through her." I thought of the conversation I had overheard 2 weeks earlier, Diane's voice at the dining table saying, "The assessment is scheduled for next month. The doctor says the documentation is almost complete." And Daniel answering, "And once it goes through, Vivienne gets her share," and Diane saying, "As agreed." I told him what I had heard. His face changed then, not with shock, because I think he had already known, but with a grief that was much quieter and harder to look at than anger. He looked toward the window at the garden. He was quiet for a long time. When he turned back to me, he asked why I was telling him this. He said I could have said nothing, kept my head down, kept my job, and walked away clean whenever this was over. I thought about that. And then I told him the truth. I told him that my ex-husband was one of the people sitting at his dining room table planning to divide up his estate, that I had taken this job out of desperation and had not known until my third week what house I had walked into, and that despite all of that, what I had watched happen to him was wrong. That someone who was being deliberately harmed deserved to know it. He looked at me for a long time. "Can I trust you?" he asked. "I think you're going to have to decide that for yourself," I said. "But I'm not going anywhere." That was the beginning of our real plan. The first thing we did was contact his original attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had represented Richard Hartwell for over 20 years and had been quietly blocked from reaching him for the past 8 months. I found the number in an old address book Mr. Hartwell kept in the locked drawer of his desk. I made the call from outside the estate on my personal phone during a walk one afternoon. Gerald Foss answered on the second ring, and when I told him who I worked for and what was happening, there was a silence on the line that said everything about how long he had been waiting for this call. Gerald arranged for an independent physician to evaluate Mr. Hartwell privately and confidentially. The evaluation took place on a day when Diane was attending a lunch in the city and Daniel and Vivian were away for the weekend. The doctor spent 2 hours with him. Her conclusion was clear. Richard Hartwell was not experiencing cognitive decline. He was experiencing the documented side effects of a specific combination of medications that, at the prescribed dosage, were known to induce confusion, disorientation, and emotional dysregulation in elderly patients. Someone had deliberately chosen that combination and that dosage. Gerald also brought a private investigator who had been quietly building a case for the past several weeks based on financial documents Gerald had obtained through separate legal channels. The investigator showed us records of transfers out of one of Mr. Hartwell's company accounts. He showed us a draft of a guardianship petition that Diane had filed with a court 2 counties over. He showed us email correspondence between Diane and Daniel discussing the plan in terms that were explicit enough to leave very little room for interpretation. For the next 3 weeks, we continued exactly as before. I brought Mr. Hartwell his meals. I sat with him in the study. When Diane visited and watched him with her careful, satisfied expression, he performed the role she expected. He was confused. He was irritable. He misremembered dates. He threw a book across the room when she asked him a pointed question about signing over power of attorney. She walked out afterward and told Daniel by phone, in the hallway where she thought I couldn't hear, that everything was on schedule. I went back into the study. Mr. Hartwell looked at me from his chair. "How was that?" he asked. "Convincing," I said. He almost smiled. The day Diane had set for the formal competency assessment arrived on a Thursday morning in early spring. She had assembled a group that included 2 physicians, a court-appointed evaluator, 2 lawyers she had retained herself, and several members of the company board. Daniel was there, seated near the windows in a chair he had positioned to look casual and confident. Vivian sat beside him. I stood near the wall behind Mr. Hartwell's chair, exactly where I had stood every other day for the past 2 months. Diane opened the meeting with a composed, rehearsed speech. She described her father's decline with the practiced grief of someone who had been preparing this performance for a long time. She used words like deteriorating and dangerous, and no longer capable. She described incidents, some real, many exaggerated or reframed. The board members shifted in their seats. The court evaluator took notes. Daniel leaned back in his chair with an expression I recognized. It was the same expression he'd had the day he told me he was leaving. The expression of someone who believed they had already won. Then Mr. Hartwell moved. He sat forward in his wheelchair. He straightened his jacket. He looked around the room slowly and deliberately, and the quality of that look was so different from anything Diane had described that 2 of the board members visibly stiffened. "I appreciate everyone coming," he said. His voice was clear and even. "Diane has gone to considerable trouble to arrange this." Diane's composure fractured for just a moment before she recovered it. "Father, you don't need to. I've been watching and listening for quite some time," he continued, as though she hadn't spoken. "And I think everyone in this room deserves to know what has actually been happening in this house." Gerald Foss stood up from his chair near the back of the room. Several people turned to look at him with visible surprise. Diane had not invited him. His presence alone told a story. Gerald placed a folder on the table and opened it. He walked through the independent medical evaluation first. He named the medications. He described the documented effects. He cited the intentional dosage. The court evaluator stopped writing and started listening with a different quality of attention. Then Gerald introduced the financial investigator, who laid out the transfers, the documents, the correspondence. He read one email aloud. It was between Diane and Daniel, written 4 months ago. In it, Diane had written that once the guardianship cleared, they needed to move quickly on the company restructuring before the board had time to review it. Daniel had replied, "Vivienne and I are ready. Just get it done." The room was very quiet. I watched Daniel's face. I watched the moment the confidence drained out of it. He looked, for the first time in all the years I had known him, like someone who had run out of room to move. Vivienne put her hand on his arm. He didn't acknowledge it. Diane looked at her father with an expression I had not seen on her before. Not anger. Not calculation. Something that looked almost like the realization that she had not accounted for this particular possibility. "This is fabricated," she said. But her voice had lost its composition. "The original documents are filed with the court," Gerald said calmly. "The medical evaluation is on record. The correspondence was recovered from servers that are now in the custody of investigators." One of the board members said, quietly but clearly, that they would be suspending all pending authorization requests, effective immediately pending a full review. The court evaluator closed his notebook and stood. Diane turned to me. I had not expected her to. In all of it, I had been standing near the wall, very still, just as I had every day for 2 months. But she turned to me now with an expression that was raw and direct. "You did this," she said. I didn't answer. Mr. Hartwell turned his chair to look at her. "She did what anyone decent would have done," he said. "She told the truth." The police had been contacted the previous evening by Gerald's office. 2 officers arrived within the hour. There was no dramatic confrontation. It was quiet and official and final. Diane was escorted from the property. Daniel stood up from his chair with an expression of cold fury, started to say something to me directly, and then seemed to think better of it when he noticed that one of the officers had turned his direction. He left without speaking. Vivienne followed her husband out without looking back at her father. The room emptied slowly. The board members spoke in low voices near the door. The court evaluator confirmed that the guardianship petition would be formally dismissed and that the original filing would be reviewed for potential fraud charges. Gerald sat down across from Mr. Hartwell, and the two of them spoke quietly for a long time. I had moved to the doorway, thinking it was time to step out, when Mr. Hartwell said my name. I turned. He was looking at me the way he had that first morning when I sat in the chair near the door and let him have his silence. Directly and without performance. "You came here as a stranger," he said. "You had every reason to keep your head down and walk away clean, and you didn't." I didn't say anything. "I had Gerald draft something," he said. "I want you to hear it." Gerald opened the folder again and explained that Mr. Hartwell had prepared a formal employment contract guaranteeing my position as a state director at a senior salary, a role I could hold for as long as I chose. There was also a separate document. A trust had been established in Emma's name, funded for her full education through graduate school, unconditional and irrevocable. I stood in the doorway of that room and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, exactly, something steadier than that. I thought about the morning I had read that job listing. $412. A debt I didn't know how to carry. Patricia's front step and Emma waving with her little backpack. I had walked into this house desperate and invisible, and I had done the only thing I knew how to do, which was to keep showing up, keep paying attention, and refuse to look away from what was wrong. Mr. Hartwell looked at me and said one more thing. "Emma is welcome here on weekends, if you'd like. The garden could use some attention." I thought about that overgrown garden. I thought about how it had looked in the winter when I arrived, wild and unattended, and how someone who loved it had clearly once spent a great deal of time in it. "She would like that," I said. 6 months later, Daniel was formally charged with conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The charges stemmed from his coordination with Diane in the guardianship scheme, which Gerald's team had fully documented. Diane faced her own charges separately, including elder financial abuse. Their trial is still ongoing. But the guardianship petition has been permanently dismissed, and Richard Hartwell's companies remain exactly where they belong. Emma comes to the estate on Saturday mornings now. She has claimed a particular corner of the garden as her own project. Mr. Hartwell occasionally watches from the window with his tea, and once or twice, I have caught him outside in his wheelchair, pointing at something in the flower bed and explaining to her very seriously the correct way to stake a climbing rose. I think about where I was 2 years ago. I think about that apartment with its empty rooms and the stack of bills on the counter and the particular kind of fear that lives in your chest when you cannot see any path forward. I did not plan any of what happened. I only stayed when it would have been easier to leave. I only told the truth when it would have been safer to stay quiet. Sometimes that is all it takes. Not a plan. Not revenge. Just staying and telling the truth and refusing to let someone be hurt when you have the power to help. That turns out to be enough to change everything. I used to think that the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing everything at once. The home, the marriage, the future you had carefully built over years. I thought that kind of loss was the end of something. I know now it was actually the beginning. When Daniel walked out, he took almost everything that could be measured. The savings, the car, the life we had built together on paper. What he could not take was the part of me that knew how to keep going. That part doesn't live in a bank account. It doesn't have a name on a lease. It lives in the quiet decision you make every morning to get up and try again, not because you feel strong, but because someone is counting on you. Emma was counting on me. That is what kept me walking into that estate every single day, even when Daniel stood in the hallway and laughed. Even when I had to carry a tray past the man who had humiliated me and say nothing. I want to be honest about something. Staying silent in those moments did not feel noble. It felt like swallowing glass. But I had learned something important in the years before all of this, something Daniel never understood. The people who act the loudest when they believe they have won are usually the ones who have built everything on someone else's foundation. That kind of power is borrowed. It doesn't hold. What I found in that estate was not what I expected. I expected a job. I found a man who was being slowly erased by the people who were supposed to love him. And I think the reason I could see it clearly was because I had just lived through my own version of it. I knew what it felt like to be diminished by someone who smiled while they did it. I recognized the pattern. That recognition was not a coincidence. It was the direct result of everything I had already been through. There is a kind of intelligence that only comes from surviving hard things with your integrity still intact. It is not the intelligence of degrees or titles. It is the intelligence of paying attention, of noticing what doesn't add up, of trusting what you observe, even when the easier thing would be to look away. I think that is the most valuable thing a person can develop. Not cleverness, not strategy, but the quiet, steady habit of seeing clearly and acting on what you see. Richard Hartwell asked me once why I helped him when I had every reason to stay out of it. The honest answer is that I couldn't not help him. Something in me that had been trained by loss and hardship and the daily discipline of showing up for Emma would not allow me to walk past what was wrong and pretend I hadn't seen it. That is what integrity actually is. Not a grand gesture. Just the repeated small choice to do the right thing even when it costs you something. Daniel and Diane built their plan on the assumption that people like me, people without money or power or family connections, would be too afraid or too tired to stand in their way. They were wrong. And the reason they were wrong is that they had spent so long measuring people by what they owned that they had completely forgotten to measure what people are made of. I am made of 7 years of trying. I am made of Patricia's front step and Emma's little backpack and $400 and a decision to keep going. That turned out to be more than enough.